All right, we've roped in Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, former ambassador and the Director of Risk Recon, to weigh in on this particular matter. Dr. Makhubela, very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. So let's start then with the call by Mexico's president there. I mean, what does this call of having the UN intervene signal about just how volatile the situation between the US and Venezuela actually has become? I mean, you have on the one hand the Trump administration insisting on a blockade, while President Maduro saying that Venezuela will continue trading oil.
Unati, thanks very much. Can I, if you allow, you indulge me, just a brief background of the challenge?
Absolutely.
So that our viewers can follow up this discussion. You know, in 1945, the Venezuelan oil was 50-50 owned by the private sector and the government. In the 1970s, under a conservative government of President Rafael Caldera, instituted what they call the reversion law, which essentially started the process of nationalizing the oil and gas industry. In 1975, that was enacted into law, and they passed that, and they nationalized the oil. Most of the companies that were doing business there, it was the American business and the British. But, you know, you remember the Standard Oil, which was a monopoly, which was dismantled later on in the United States. But they were paid for their services and paid by bonds and so on. Then the third stage of nationalization came in the 1990s by Hugo Chavez. He started to reinforce that to basically share the revenue from the oil to the poor. And that's when the problem then began. So you've seen this argument by President Trump that they want what belongs to them. They were compensated for the nationalization. But international law, Unite, is straightforward, that it is clear that the sovereign state has the sovereign right over its mineral resources. So there's no other state that has any sovereign control over that. And that's called the principle of permanent sovereignty and of national resources. Yeah. That's where the issue is. But the big problem then, Unati, is that, you know, Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves around the world. It is estimated so far now that they have about 303 billion barrels of oil reserves, much larger than what Saudi Arabia is having. So that's where the big problem then began. In the United States, in need of more oil. The US, as we are talking, they produce about 12.7 million barrels of oil per day, but they consume about 19.7 barrels. So they need to balance that. But Unati, they've issued out the national security strategy, which then defies the hemisphere of the United States, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. So that's where the big tension is coming off.
Yeah. And I mean, just based on that, it has then nothing to do with what we've been saying. You know, firstly, you have a White House official claiming that the U.S. created the oil industry in Venezuela. And then you have, on the other hand, the administration saying that it has more to do with an issue related to narcotics. I mean, this clearly is all about oil. And having said that then, and going back to, you know, what you were talking about in terms of international law, under the international law, can then the United States have any legal basis then, to your point too, to enforce this blockade on Venezuela? And if so, what precedent would it, then bring, particularly, or set rather, particularly when you look at resource-rich nations that have, and the word that you've used is nationalized strategic assets in other countries?
You know, Unati, the blockade by the United States is a bit unfortunate. You would know that yesterday, Venezuela presented a request for convening the urgent meeting of the Security Council to discuss what they call an illegal blockade of Venezuela. So that meeting is likely to take place next week, but the United States has a veto in that meeting. But the blockade that they are having this afternoon, Maduro has given instructions to escort all the oil tankers leaving and coming into Venezuela. So it's likely to create tension. The United States said it's going to review the latest move by Venezuela. What it would take, Unati, is just a small disinformation that can result in a series of fatalities that can then spiral out of control. And that's why the president of Mexico, she's quite correct to appeal to the United States to exercise some level of restraint. So the question of the narcotic thing that the US has been making excuses about is non-existent. Venezuela exports a lot of oil to China. I mean, the Chinese are also one of the biggest consumers of oil. I mean, the Chinese are much more in a worse state than the Americans. I think they produce something like 4 million barrels per day, and they consume close to 15 million barrels per day. So the need for oil keeps on rising. The challenge is, Unati, in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, that the Iranians have absolute control over it, and the Bab al-Mandab Strait that give access to the Red Sea and the movement of oil resources and other logistics is at the heart of the challenge that the United States is looking for alternatives.
Yeah.
But you realize also, Nati, that in the G20 agenda of the US, the question of the security of oil and energy and very cheap energy is top of the agenda of the United States because President Trump has made promises for a cheaper petrol and he hasn't realized that. So that's a commitment he has with his own electorate. So it's creating this global tension. And I'm just worried that if you were to shoot some of the oil tankers that belongs to China, you are likely to see confrontation emerging in the area.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the Security Council because I was going to ask you how realistic is the UN intervention in a standoff where one of the key players, the United States, is a permanent member of the Security Council. I want you to expand on just the global impact. How could a blockade or even further escalation affect global oil markets, especially amid what we are already seeing, fragile energy supply chains?
You know, when Trump gave his speech yesterday about his 100 days in office, he did not make mention of any tension that is building with Venezuela. The oil markets went down, there was confidence, but the United States needs cheaper oil to be able to beef up its own oil drilling, particularly within Texas, because it's deep oil drilling there, which is so expensive. So if the price of oil is high, so they're unlikely to become very profitable. So that's where one challenge is. But you know, this tension that is building up is likely to drag the whole world into some form of chaos in terms of the prices of oil. Venezuela is a member of OPEC. It's a founding member of OPEC in 1960, and the OPEC countries are quite on this matter. They haven't come up with any pronouncement because if you look at what Venezuela has and what they produce, I mean, last year, Unati, Venezuela sold about 4.5 billion worth of oil with the amount of reserve they are having. If they were to put more into the oil market, it would the prices of oil will drop a little bit.
Yeah.
But the United States is quite keen on capturing the resources of Venezuela. That's where the problem is.
Dr. Makhubela, I'm fast running out of time, but I want to squeeze in this last question. What are the early warning signs then, should the international community be watching here, that indicates the situation is tipping towards violence or war?
The United States, to deploy the ground forces in Venezuela, they have to get permission from Congress. We've seen debate yesterday in Congress, and this debate is carrying on in terms of authorizing the United States to take military action. So we need to look into that. If Congress authorizes that, then you're likely to see a full-scale conflict between Venezuela and the United States.
Dr. Makhubela, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. That is Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, former ambassador and the Director of Risk Recon, just weighing in on those growing tensions between the United States and Venezuela.